So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the punctuation of John 1 verses 3 to 4 in the Syriac Peshitta version of the New Testament. Now, the punctuation of John 1 verses 3 to 4 is a very well-known problem in New Testament scholarship. The issue has to do with where to place the period in John 1 verse 3. Does the period come at the very end of the verse, after the final words of John 1 verse 3? Or does the period come just before the final words of John 1 verse 3? The first option is found in most English translations of the New Testament. It's the one that's found in the NIV, and it's the one that will be most familiar to English readers of the New Testament. This is what it says in the NIV. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. And so notice that in the NIV, the period comes after the words, that has been made, and verse 4 begins a new sentence. Now, even though that's the division that is most familiar to English readers of the New Testament, that is not the only way that this passage can be understood. And so the second option is found in the NRSV, and this is what it says. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. Period. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And so notice that in this translation, the period comes before the final words of verse 3. And the final words of verse 3 begin a new sentence that carries on into verse 4. Well, even though the first option seems most natural to most English readers of the New Testament, there are a couple of issues that make the choice between these two options a little bit more complicated. The first issue is that even though the versification of John 1 verses 3 to 4 favors the first option, the option that's found in the NIV, it's important to remember that when the Gospel of John was written, it wasn't divided up into verses. The current system of verses that we have was introduced by a French New Testament scholar named Robert Etienne, 1503 to 1559, in an edition of the Greek New Testament that he published in 1551. And so that means that the verse divisions that we use today can't be used to settle the issue. The second issue is that unlike modern translations of the New Testament, and unlike modern editions of the Greek New Testament, the Gospel of John was originally written without punctuation. This means that when the Gospel of John was first written, there weren't any markings in the text to indicate where we should end the sentence in verse 3. So we can't use the punctuation that we have in our modern editions of the New Testament to decide the issue. And the third issue is that even though the first option might seem more natural to most English readers of the Bible, this doesn't seem to have been the case for many of the earliest readers of the New Testament. And so before the Council of Nicaea, there seems to have been a consensus that the second option, the one that's found in the NRSV, was the right option. In other words, before the Council of Nicaea, there seems to have been a consensus that the period should be placed before the final words of verse 3, and that the final words of verse 3 begin a new sentence that continues on into verse 4. And so in this video, we're not going to be able to solve the issue of where to place the punctuation in John 1 verse 3. But what we can do is show how this verse was understood by the person who is responsible for translating the Gospel of John in the Peshitta version of the New Testament. And unlike the Gospel of John in the original in Greek, the Peshitta is very clear about where the sentence ends in verse 3 and where the punctuation should be put. And so that's our plan for this video. Let's get right into it. And so this is what the Peshitta version of John 1 verses 3 to 4 says, and I'll be using a modified East Syriac pronunciation. This is what it says. Kul bidewa uvel avau afla hava hawaf. Medem da hawa ve haya hawa. Uhaye ithaihon nura davnai nasha. Which means, everything came into being through him, and without him not even one thing came into being. What came into being through him was life, and life was the light of human beings. And so, like I mentioned, the grammar of this passage lets us know how the translator understood John 1 verse 3. In other words, the grammar of this passage lets us know that the translator of John 1 verse 3 understood this passage more in line with the NRSV rather than with the NIV. Let's take a look at the Greek grammar of this passage, and then we'll get into the grammar in the Peshitta. And so the most important thing that we need to know about the grammar of this passage in Greek is that the final words of verse 3 begin with a relative pronoun. Now, there are two different ways that we could understand that relative pronoun. Now, the first possibility is that the relative pronoun begins a clause that modifies or clarifies the meaning of the word hen, which means one thing. So in this case, we would translate it, and without him, not one thing came into being that has come into being. The words that has come into being refers back to the words not one thing. And it basically means not one thing has come into being out of all of the things that have come into being. But the other possibility is that the relative pronoun begins a clause that functions as the subject of the verb ein in the next clause. So in this case, we would translate it, that which came into being was life, and so on. Now, both ways of understanding the relative pronoun are possible in Greek. But here is the problem in the Peshitta. The problem is that in Syriac, the final words of John 1 verse 3 do not begin with a relative particle, which would be the equivalent to a relative pronoun. The final words of John 1 verse 3 begin with the word medem. Now, very often that word medem is used when you want to make a relative clause the subject or object of a verb. So, for example, in John 2 verse 5 it says, "And she said to the servants, that which he says to you, do." And in this case, the word that in the Peshitta is the word medem. And the phrase, that which he says to you, functions as the object of the verb do. Or in John 3 verse 6 it says, that which is born from flesh is flesh. The word that in the Peshitta is the word medem. And the phrase, that which is born from flesh, functions as the subject of the clause. And so the word medem in John 1 verse 3 can't refer back to the word one thing or the words not even one thing. It begins a clause that functions as the subject of the verb hawa in verse 4. But here is another problem. And so even if we could somehow make medem function like a relative pronoun, the verb that comes next to it is in the wrong gender. The verb that comes after medem is a third masculine singular perfect verb. But the word one thing in the phrase not even one thing is feminine. So the final words of verse 3 can't point back to the phrase not even one thing because the genders do not match. And so when we take a look at the grammar of the Peshitta version of this passage, it is very clear how the translator understood this passage. The period does not come at the end of John 1 verse 3. The period comes right before the final words of verse 3. And the final words of verse 3 begin a sentence that continues on into John 1 verse 4. Now, that doesn't solve the issue of how this passage should be understood based on how it was originally written, how the author intended this passage to be understood, but it does give us an insight into how one early reader of this passage understood the punctuation of John 1 verses 3 to 4.